A little girl's drawing left on a billionaire's dashboard turns into the spark that changes everything for her single dad and for a man who thought he had it all. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The alarm buzzed like a fly trapped in a tin can, and Michael Turner slapped it off without even opening his eyes. A moment later, the weight of the day crept in heavy, unrelenting. He sat up with a groan, ran a hand through his messy hair, and listened. The house was quiet, too quiet. That meant Emily was still asleep. He was already behind. "Em, let's go, baby," he called, knocking lightly on her door as he passed. "We're late." No answer. He opened the door to find his 7-year-old daughter curled into a tight ball, the blankets kicked halfway to the floor, her hair a halo of tangles. For a second, Michael just watched her. She looked so peaceful it hurt. He knelt beside the bed and brushed the hair from her face. "Come on, sunshine. You don't want to miss pancake day at school, do you?" That did the trick. Emily stirred, groaned, then slowly cracked one eye open. "Do they have strawberries today? If we hustle, we'll find out." 20 minutes later, the kitchen was a blur of toast crumbs, mismatched socks, and a backpack missing one strap. Michael flipped a slice of burnt toast onto a paper towel and handed it to her as she slipped on her shoes, still half asleep. "Where's your math homework?" he asked, rummaging through a pile of papers on the counter. "In my folder," she mumbled through a bite of toast. He eyed the folder suspiciously. "This folder?" "No, the purple one." Michael exhaled, hard, found the purple one, and stuffed it into her backpack. He checked the clock. He was supposed to be at the shop in 15 minutes. Emily's school bell rang in 20. As they piled into the car, frost still clinging to the windshield, Michael muttered to himself, "We've got this." Just another morning. The car rattled to life, coughing once before settling into its usual tired hum. Emily buckled up in the back seat, humming a song under her breath. Michael glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her cheeks still puffy from sleep, her eyes bright despite the rush. For a moment, the chaos faded. This was their life. Scrappy, unpredictable, stitched together with love and duct tape. And somehow, they made it work. The sky was still wearing its early morning gray when Michael pulled up to Turner's Auto, his second home, and sometimes his only sanctuary. The lot was half empty, the cracked pavement slick with melted frost. He killed the engine and turned to Emily, who sat in the back seat with her backpack hugging her chest like a life vest. "You sure you're okay hanging out at the shop today?" he asked. Emily nodded, her ponytail bobbing. "Can I draw on the whiteboard again?" Michael smiled. "As long as you don't erase the oil change schedule this time." "I was making room," she said matter-of-factly. He shook his head, amused. He hadn't planned on bringing her to work, not today. But Mrs. Callahan, the sweet retired neighbor who usually watched Emily on short notice, had called in sick with a cough that sounded like it came from the bottom of the ocean. There wasn't anyone else to call, and Michael couldn't afford to miss another shift. Bills didn't pause for family emergencies. The garage was warm inside, the space already filled with the comforting scent of rubber, gasoline, and coffee gone stale. He flipped the lights on and tossed his keys onto the counter, then helped Emily out of her coat. Her boots squeaked against the concrete floor as she followed him to the break room. "Breakfast round 2, he announced, placing a banana and a granola bar on the table. Emily wrinkled her nose but took them anyway. "Thanks, Daddy." He kissed the top of her head. "I'll be just out in the bay. You stay in here okay? Or if you come out, goggles on and no touching anything shiny." She saluted. "Copy that." By 8:30, Michael was elbow deep in a '98 pickup that coughed like it had been smoking for 50 years. Emily had set up a quiet little station in the corner, office crayons, paper, and an army of plastic dinosaurs forming a haphazard defense line. She looked so small sitting there, legs swinging under the desk. But she belonged here in a way, folded into the rhythm of the place. And for all the things he couldn't give her, Michael could give her this: time, warmth, and the comfort of knowing she was never an afterthought. The day had settled into its usual rhythm, wrenches clinking, tires hissing, and the occasional thud of a dropped socket echoing through the garage. Michael wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and leaned under the hood of an old Civic that smelled like it hadn't been serviced since dial-up internet was still a thing. Then came the sound that didn't belong. Not the coughing engine of a town car or the familiar chug of an old pickup, but a low, clean hum. The kind of sound you'd hear in a city showroom, not on the cracked pavement of Turner's Auto. Michael straightened, eyebrows raised, and turned toward the garage doors. A sleek black SUV rolled in slowly, headlights cutting through the dim interior. The paint gleamed like a mirror, and the chrome trim looked like it hadn't seen a speck of dust in its life. The kind of vehicle that cost more than most homes in Maplewood. Definitely not local. Michael exchanged a glance with Ricky, the high school intern sweeping near the oil drums. "You expecting someone fancy?" Ricky muttered. "Nope." The SUV came to a stop just outside Bay 2. The engine went quiet, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant rattle of Emily giggling in the office as her plastic dinosaurs battled it out on the desk. Then the door opened, and out stepped a man in a dark wool coat, tailored so perfectly, it looked like it came with its own security clearance. Tall, clean-cut, late 30s, maybe sharp jawline, hair too neat for a mechanic's world. His shoes didn't have a speck of grease on them, which alone made Michael suspicious. "Something I can help you with?" Michael asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached. The man looked around like he hadn't been in a place like this in years, maybe ever. "Hope so," he said. "Check engine light came on about 5 miles back. I figured I'd pull in before it became a bigger issue." Michael nodded slowly, still sizing him up. "You're a long way from where people usually drive that kind of car." The man smiled faintly, offering his hand. "Daniel Mercer." Michael shook it, the name ticking something at the edge of memory, but he let it go. "Well, Mr. Mercer, let's take a look under the hood." Michael popped the hood with a practiced flick, the smooth click of the latch breaking the silence. A soft hiss of heat rose from the engine, and he leaned in, brow furrowed. Everything about the SUV was pristine, polished, spotless, high-end, but even the fanciest rides still coughed up trouble now and then. Daniel stood a few steps back, hands in the pockets of his coat, watching quietly. He didn't seem the type to get his hands dirty, not in the physical sense anyway. The man had the calm detachment of someone used to letting other people handle his problems. Still, there wasn't any arrogance in his posture, just quiet curiosity. Michael checked a few things under the hood, nodding to himself as he spotted the culprit. "Loose connector to the ignition coil. Nothing serious. Might have been jostled loose on the highway." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" "Lucky day," Michael said, grabbing a wrench. "Another 10 miles and you might have been stranded." From the office, Emily peeked through the window, her face pressed against the glass, hands cupped around her eyes like binoculars. Her crayons lay forgotten on the table. Something about the visitor intrigued her. Michael noticed her watching and gave her a quick wink before tightening the connector and double-checking the wiring. Emily grinned and disappeared from view, likely back to her drawing. "Your daughter?" Daniel asked, following his gaze. "Yeah, Emily," Michael said, his tone softening. "No sitter today, so she's helping me hold down the fort." Daniel smiled faintly. "She seems like a smart one." "She is. Smarter than me, that's for sure." There was a pause, the kind that settled comfortably between people who didn't feel the need to fill silence with small talk. Michael finished the quick fix, wiped his hands on a rag, and gave the engine a tap. "Go ahead, fire it up." Daniel climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The SUV purred to life, smooth and steady. He stepped back out, clearly impressed. "Well done," he said. "What do I owe you?" Michael shook his head. "Don't worry about it. 5-minute fix." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. That kind of honesty's rare. Michael just shrugged. "Around here, it's kind of the standard." The scent of motor oil drifted into the office, faint but familiar, like background music to Emily's world. She sat cross-legged in the wheeled chair behind the front desk, her chin resting on her hand as she stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of her. Her backpack was slumped in the corner, her granola bar half-eaten beside a dusty cup of pens. She had been here before, plenty of times actually. Days when the sitter canceled, or when Michael had to pick her up early from school. Turner's Auto was practically her second home, and even though it smelled funny and the heater clanked like it was haunted, it was their place. With a small sigh, she unzipped her crayon pouch and dumped its colorful contents across the counter. "Okay, Rainbow Army," she murmured, picking out her favorite blue. "Let's make something cool." She started with a boxy shape of car, lopsided and smiling, with smoke puffs curling from the hood. Then she added a stick figure with messy hair and big arms, crouched beside it with a wrench. That was her dad, of course. She gave him a crooked grin and a smudge of brown for his beard. Next came the garage. She filled it with floating tires, tools, and little lines to show the grease everywhere. She even drew herself peeking from the corner window, arms waving like a flag. "Emily's daddy saves the day," she wrote in careful slanted letters across the top. From outside, she could hear muffled voices, her dad talking with the man in the nice coat. Something about the way that man spoke made her ears perk up earlier. He didn't sound like the other customers. He talked slow, like he was thinking three things at once. Important, maybe, or lonely. She looked back down at her drawing, then tilted her head, studying it. A quick grin spread across her face. She grabbed a purple crayon and added one more figure tall, with shiny shoes standing beside her dad. She wasn't sure why. It just felt right. Folding the drawing carefully, Emily tucked it into the pile of finished papers and sat back with a proud little nod. To her, it was just a picture. To someone else, it might be the beginning of something big. The sound of the SUV's engine hummed softly as Daniel stood beside it, checking his watch for the third time. A phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered with a quiet, clipped, "Yes," turning away to pace a few steps in the gravel lot. His voice lowered, the conversation filled with half-sentences and sharp nods, words like acquisition and non-disclosure slipping through the morning air like cold wind. Inside the office, Emily peeked from behind the counter. She watched Daniel polished, important, and kind of mysterious glance at his sleek car, like it was a spaceship ready to launch. She clutched the folded piece of paper in her hand, fingers smudged with crayon. She wasn't sure why, but something told her he needed it. Maybe it was the way he had smiled at her like she mattered. Or the way her dad had looked when he talked to him, calm but curious, like he didn't quite know what to make of the man in the tailored coat. The door chimed gently as she stepped outside. Daniel was still on the call, now speaking fast and low. Emily tiptoed up to the passenger side of the SUV and gently opened the door. Her heart pounded, like she was doing something much bigger than it really was. She laid the drawing on the seat, right on top of a sleek leather folder that looked way too serious. "For luck," she whispered, like it was a spell. She shut the door carefully, then darted back inside before anyone noticed. A minute later, Daniel ended his call and walked back to the vehicle. "Thanks again, Michael," he said, his expression already shifting into business mode. Michael gave a small nod, wiping his hands on a shop towel. "Drive safe." Without another word, Daniel slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, and the SUV rolled out of the lot, tires crunching over gravel, the morning sun catching on its polished frame as it disappeared down the road. He didn't see the drawing at first. Not yet. But it was there resting silently on the seat beside him, waiting. A stick figure hero in greasy overalls, a crooked car, and a smiling girl waving from the corner. Just a crayon sketch. But it wouldn't stay just that for long. The skyline of the city came into view like a steel mirage, sharp, cold, and familiar. Daniel Mercer sat behind the wheel of his SUV, Bluetooth calls rolling through one after the other, his voice steady and efficient. Numbers, schedules, people he would never meet, moving parts in an empire he barely felt anymore. Traffic thickened as he turned into the underground parking garage of Mercer Tower, the security gate rising automatically. He pulled into his private space, killing the engine with a tired exhale. The concrete walls around him felt more like a bunker than a parking lot. He was home. Technically. He grabbed his phone, his folder, his keys, and then paused. There it was. The drawing. Folded, slightly wrinkled, sitting on the leather passenger seat like it belonged there. He didn't remember seeing it before. Curious, Daniel picked it up and unfolded the page, smoothing it with both hands. Crayon lines. A lopsided car. A man with stick-figure muscles, wild brown scribbles for hair, crouched with a wrench. A smaller girl figure, waving beside him. A heading at the top in shaky block letters. Emily's daddy saves the day. He stared at it. For a long time he didn't move. It was childish, imperfect, a mess of color and crooked lines. But there was something in it, something warm, honest. The little girl had drawn this with pride, love. And the man in the picture, it wasn't just a mechanic to her. He was a hero, a constant. The kind of figure Daniel couldn't remember having in his own childhood. He looked closer. Was that himself? A tall figure added beside the dad, standing still, arms at his sides. He hadn't been part of the moment, not really. But she'd drawn him in anyway. Daniel let out a quiet breath he didn't know he was holding. The world he lived in, the boardrooms, the stock tickers, the concrete towers, none of it ever stopped him in his tracks like this. He folded the paper gently, slipping it into his briefcase. Not to throw away, to keep. And for reasons he didn't quite understand yet, Daniel Mercer found himself thinking about Maplewood, a quiet mechanic, and a little girl who saw things as they truly were. Daniel sat at the head of a long, polished conference table, surrounded by glass walls and people who spoke in bullet points. The skyline glimmered beyond the windows, the city stretching out in sharp angles and muted ambition. Numbers flashed on a presentation screen, charts detailing quarterly growth and market share. Someone was talking something about projections, something about Europe. But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind kept drifting back to the folded piece of crayon art now tucked inside the inner pocket of his briefcase. He had glanced at it that morning while waiting for his espresso to brew, just a peek, just to prove to himself that it hadn't been a fluke, that it was still as disarmingly honest as he remembered. It was. The little girl's drawing hadn't changed, but he had. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the dad was drawn, not as some background figure, not with tired eyes or slumped shoulders like most of the men Daniel saw, dragged down by obligation. No, this guy was front and center, a hero, a giant. And there beside him, small and smiling, was the girl who clearly believed it with every fiber of her being, and then there was him, that lone figure off to the side. It was strange how a handful of crayon lines could make a man feel seen and exposed. He hadn't been drawn in out of obligation. She'd added him because, somehow, he'd left a mark. And he couldn't remember the last time that happened without it being tied to his net worth or company name. A voice brought him back to the present. "Daniel?" One of the execs looked at him expectantly. "You okay with moving forward on the Seattle acquisition?" Daniel blinked. "Yes," he said, out of habit more than conviction. "Let's move forward." The meeting resumed. More numbers. More buzzwords. But inside, something had shifted. A quiet hum beneath the surface. It wasn't just the drawing. It was what it stirred. Memories of a time before strategy and spreadsheets. Before every relationship came with a contract. A time when people drew pictures because they wanted you to feel something, not because they wanted something from you. Daniel Mercer hadn't realized how long he'd been numb until a 7-year-old reminded him what warmth looked like. The excuse came to him somewhere between the 68th and 69th floor of Mercer Tower, in the dead space between meetings. He had phrased it simply to his assistant. "The SUV's still acting up. I want to take it back to the guy in Maplewood. No need to schedule anything." He didn't mention the drawing. or the fact that the SUV was running perfectly, or that he had already had it quietly inspected by one of his private mechanics, who'd found nothing wrong. That part didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was that he couldn't stop thinking about that small garage tucked behind a diner, and the little girl who had drawn a crayon version of his life that felt more honest than any boardroom memo ever had. The drive back to Maplewood felt different this time. Slower. Less like an obligation and more like a detour he didn't want to explain. He kept catching himself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting the drawing to be waiting for him again. By the time he pulled into Turner's Auto, the afternoon sun was soft, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The garage door was half open, the familiar hum of a drill echoing inside. Daniel stepped out, smoothing his coat and adjusting the collar. He had dressed down this Timeno tie, dark jeans instead of slacks. Still didn't quite blend in, but at least he didn't look like he'd taken a wrong turn off Wall Street. Michael looked up from under the hood of a dusty sedan, surprise flickering in his eyes for just a second before he wiped his hands on a rag. "Back already?" "Yeah," Daniel said, clearing his throat. "Still getting that weird hesitation when I started. Thought I'd bring it to someone I trust." Michael nodded, no questions asked. "Pop the hood. I'll take a look." From the office, the bell above the door jingled. Emily peeked out, crayon in hand, her eyes lighting up when she saw Daniel. She waved shyly, then ducked back behind the counter. Daniel couldn't help the small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was back for the SUV, sure. But more than that, he was back because a piece of him, some forgotten, quieter part had started to wake up. The coffee at Turner's Auto was nothing fancy burnt at the edges, thick, with too much grounds and too little water, but it was hot, and that counted for something. Michael poured 2 paper cups from the dented pot in the break room and handed one to Daniel without asking if he took cream or sugar. "Around here, you either drank it straight or didn't drink it at all." Daniel took a cautious sip and winced. This coffee could strip paint. Michael chuckled, leaning against the workbench. "That's how we know it's doing its job." Outside, the afternoon had settled into the golden lull between rush hours. The shop was quiet for once, just the soft hiss of the air compressor cooling and Emily humming off-key in the office as she colored. It was the kind of pause that didn't come often, and Daniel took it. "I have to admit," he said, cradling the cup, "I don't usually hang out at garages, but yours has a different feel." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "Yeah." Daniel glanced toward the office. "Feels like a place built by someone who actually gives a damn." Michael looked down into his coffee, swirling it slightly. "I guess I do. Or I try to. Folks around here don't have a lot of places they can afford to trust." Daniel nodded slowly. "You always been here? Maplewood, I mean." "Born and raised," Michael said. "Left for a while, military, then came back when Emily's mom got sick. Been running this place ever since." There was a weight in his voice when he mentioned her, not heavy like grief anymore, but settled. "Carried." Daniel studied him a moment. "You run a whole business, raise a kid on your own, fix half the town's cars, and you don't even charge half the time. What keeps you going?" Michael gave a small shrug, like he hadn't really stopped to think about it. "I've got a daughter who looks at me like I can fix anything. That kind of belief, it'll keep a man upright, even when the world's pushing hard the other way." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just stared down at the dark swirl of his coffee, the garage light, reflecting off its surface like ripples in a quiet lake. There was more to Michael Turner than calloused hands and quiet smiles. And Daniel was just starting to realize he wanted to know what. While Michael slid under the SUV with a flashlight clenched between his teeth and a wrench in hand, Daniel found himself seated on an overturned milk crate just outside the office. It wasn't exactly a conference room, but he stayed there anyway, coffee in one hand, the lingering scent of oil in the air, and a quiet little voice breaking through the silence. Emily had wandered out from the office, her arms full of a tattered chapter book and a fistful of crayons. She plopped down cross-legged on the floor beside him, oblivious to how strange the moment might seem to anyone else. "You don't look like people who usually come here," she said matter-of-factly, opening her book but not reading it. Daniel smiled, folding his hands. "No?" She shook her head. "They usually wear flannel and smell like trucks. You smell like hotel soap." That made him really laugh, for the first time in days. "I'll take that as a compliment." She grinned. "It wasn't mean. You just smell like someone who reads a lot and forgets breakfast." He blinked at her. "Okay. Now that feels uncomfortably accurate." Emily turned the page in her book and leaned closer, whispering, "You know what I like about you?" Daniel tilted his head. "No, but I'd love to find out." "You're quiet," she said. "Like Daddy, but not the scary kind of quiet. You think a lot." He didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever pointed it out so plainly, and certainly not a kid with a rainbow crayon tucked behind her ear. "You like books?" she asked, motioning to her own. "I used to," he admitted, "before I started working too much. Daddy says that's when you need books the most." Daniel looked down at her messy ponytail, and socks slightly falling off her heel. There was nothing calculated about her. No pretense, just a kid talking to a stranger like he was safe, like he mattered. "You're lucky," he said softly. She frowned. "Why?" "Because you know who your hero is." Emily smiled. "You mean Daddy?" "Yeah. He's the best fixer in the whole world." Daniel looked back toward the SUV, where Michael was working in silence, completely unaware of the effect his daughter's words and her presence were having on someone who thought he'd already seen everything. Turns out, he hadn't. Daniel's driver's side window was down as he cruised slowly down Maplewood's main street, the wind warm and unfiltered, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass, baking bread, and something faintly metallic, maybe the distant clang of tools from Michael's shop. It was a far cry from the recycled air of boardrooms and high-rises, where everything smelled like sanitizer and stress. He told his assistant he was exploring potential land acquisitions. That Maplewood was a promising site for a regional logistics hub, technically not a lie. But really, he just wanted an excuse to come back. No one questioned him. After all, who was going to doubt Daniel Mercer, the man with a billion-dollar company and a calendar booked 6 weeks out? Still, he hadn't returned to Maplewood with a deal memo or site plans. He came with his sleeves rolled up and his phone purposely on airplane mode. Because something about this little town, with its sagging porches and sun-bleached signs, slowed his pulse in a way he couldn't quite explain. He parked in front of the corner diner, stepping out to the sound of wind chimes and the sight of a teenager lazily hosing down the sidewalk. No one here recognized him, at least not openly. A couple of curious glances, a polite nod or two, but no fanfare. No questions about stock prices or merger talks. Just a man in a quiet town trying to breathe. Later he wandered into the bookstore, if it could be called that. A narrow shop tucked between a barber shop and a second-hand furniture store with creaky floors and a bell above the door that jingled like something out of a movie. The woman behind the counter didn't bat an eye when he picked up a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, just rang him up and said, "That one'll stick with you." He liked that. The simplicity of it. As the day wore on, he stopped by the Gare Jeannot with a car problem this time, but with 2 coffees and a half excuse about just passing through. Michael had squinted at him. Suspicious, but not unfriendly. Emily, on the other hand, had beamed like he was a returning knight. Daniel stayed for nearly an hour, not talking much, just watching the rhythm of the place. The banter, the oil-stained floor, the life that hummed beneath the grease and bolts. Maplewood didn't have Wi-Fi strong enough to stream anything. No 5-star hotels, not even decent sushi. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel like he needed any of that. Here, no one expected him to be Daniel Mercer, CEO. He was just Daniel. And for now, that was enough. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long amber streaks across the garage floor as Michael closed up for the day. The last car had rumbled out an hour ago, and Emily was in the office, sprawled on the worn couch with a library book and a juice box. Daniel sat on a stool by the tool bench, his jacket slung over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked like he belonged, somehow comfortable, in the grease-stained stillness of the garage. Like this place had rubbed off on him in just the right way. Michael didn't mind the company. At least, he hadn't until Ricky, the high school kid who helped out part-time, wandered in with a grin and a phone in hand. "Hey, Mr. Turner," Ricky said, holding up the screen. "Did you know your buddy's famous?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Ricky turned the phone toward him. It was a news article. Daniel's face, front and center. Daniel Mercer, tech giant, expands into new markets. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion. Below the headline was a photo Daniel in a suit, shaking hands with some government official, all polished steel and sharp smiles. Michael's eyes locked on it, and then shifted to the man still sitting casually in his shop, sipping coffee like he didn't own half the coast. "Daniel," Michael said, his voice low, steady, "you want to tell me what this is?" Daniel set the coffee down, slow and deliberate. "I was going to tell you, Michael held up a hand. "So you're him. The Mercer Technologies, the buildings, the satellites, the whole thing." "I didn't come here to pitch you something," Daniel said. "I just needed a break. And then I met you. Emily. I didn't want that to change." Michael's jaw tightened. "And yet, it changes everything." Emily peeked around the corner, sensing the shift in the room, but Michael's voice softened. "Stay in the office, sweetheart." He looked back at Daniel. "You came in here pretending to be just some guy with a busted SUV. And all this time, I've been talking to a man who's got a net worth bigger than this town's entire tax roll." Daniel stood, his voice calm. "I wasn't pretending to be anyone. I was just trying to be real for once." Michael's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Yeah, well, real people don't hide who they are." He turned away, jaw clenched, the weight of the moment settling heavy across his shoulders. Daniel didn't follow. He just stood there in the fading light, surrounded by rust and honesty and the consequences of not being either. The shop was dark now, except for the glow of a single hanging bulb over Bay 2, casting long shadows across the empty floor. Michael sat on a milk crate near the back wall, his elbows on his knees, hands laced together, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The scent of motor oil lingered like a second skin, grounding him in a space that had always felt safe until now. He could still hear Daniel's voice echoing in his head. "I didn't want it to change anything." But it had. Of course it had. Because nothing about Daniel Mercer was ordinary. The man had walked into their lives like he didn't belong to another world. But he did. And now, Michael couldn't pretend he didn't know that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph creased at the corners, edges faded. His wife, Anna, laughing on the back porch in the spring sunlight. Emily only a baby in her arms. Michael traced her smile with his thumb. She'd always seen the best in people. Always said the world could surprise you if you let it. But Michael had been surprised before. He'd learned that charm and wealth often came with strings expectations, conditions, distance. When Anna got sick, there were no powerful friends stepping in, no CEOs writing checks, just bills and worry, and empty promises. He'd learned then that when life hit hard, the only thing you could count on was yourself. He looked toward the office window, where Emily was fast asleep on the couch under a faded blanket. Her crayon drawings were scattered on the table next to her, and a juice box lay on its side, long since empty. She didn't know what Daniel was, who he was. To her, he was just a nice man who listened, who smiled when she talked about dinosaurs and stories, and her dad. And that's what scared Michael the most. Because she trusted him, and Michael didn't know if that trust would survive. The truther, if he could protect her. From what came next. He rubbed a hand over his face, the weight pressing harder tonight. The kind of weight that only comes when a father knows his whole world is just 7 years old, curled up on a couch, dreaming dreams he's desperate to keep whole. And now, a billionaire was part of those dreams. The next morning was quiet in that heavy, uncertain way, like the world was holding its breath. Michael moved through the motions of opening the shop without saying much. He unlocked the doors, flipped the open sign, checked the register, swept the floor that didn't need sweeping. Emily trailed behind him in her fuzzy socks and pajama top, unusually subdued. She'd sensed the tension the night before. Of course she had. Kids always did. Michael poured himself a cup of coffee, black and too hot, and sat at the small table in the break room. Emily climbed into the chair across from him, her knees tucked to her chest. She had her drawing pad in her lap, but for once she didn't open it. "Daddy?" she said, her voice soft. "Yeah, Em." She fidgeted with the corner of her notepad, then met his eyes. "Are you mad at Daniel?" Michael hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. "I'm disappointed. I just wish he'd been honest from the start." Emily nodded slowly, as if that made sense. Then she said, "I knew." He blinked. "Knew what?" "That he was someone important." Michael set his mug down, carefully. "Emily." "I saw him on the news once," she said, picking at a hangnail. "At school, when we were learning about inventions and technology, the teacher showed us a video. He was talking about space stuff and helping schools and, I don't know, it was him." Michael leaned back in his chair, trying to process her words. "Why didn't you say anything?" She shrugged. "Because he wasn't acting like someone important. He was just nice. He listened. He liked my drawings. He didn't talk down to me or tell me I was wrong." Her voice grew quieter. "I thought if I told you, you'd look at him different. And you did." Michael looked at her, really looked at her. His daughter, all of 7 years old, with a heart too big and a sense of people sharper than most grown men. "He's not like the others," she said. "The ones who only care about money. He cares about you. And me." Michael felt something crack open inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the start of understanding. He reached across the table, gently took her hand in his calloused one, and gave it a small squeeze. "Thanks for telling me, kiddo." Emily offered a sleepy little smile. "You're still my hero, you know." Michael swallowed hard. "And you're mine, Em." It was late afternoon when the knock came, 3 quick raps against the glass front door of the garage. Michael looked up from beneath the hood of a Camry and instinctively wiped his hands on a rag. Emily was on the office floor, reorganizing her crayon collection by color, humming softly to herself. Daniel stood just outside, not in a suit this time, but something a little more formal than the jeans and coffee vibe he'd tried to blend in with before. Navy slacks. A button-down. That same calm expression, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. Michael opened the door, cautious but not cold. "You lost again?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Not this time." There was a pause. Not quite awkward, just full. Like both men were waiting to see who'd speak first. "I wanted to ask you something," Daniel said finally, his voice low, serious. Michael crossed his arms. "Go ahead. There's a gala this weekend. Company event. It's a big deal. Press, donors, a few board members. Usually, I wouldn't even mention it, but I want you to come." He glanced toward the office. "You and Emily." Michael blinked. "You're inviting a mechanic and a second grader to a black-tie corporate event?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Yes." Michael let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Why?" "Because," Daniel said, stepping closer, "I want you to see the world I come from, the real one, the noise, the flash, the people I deal with. I want you to see what I'm walking away from when I drive 2 hours, just to talk to a little girl about dinosaurs and crayons." Michael studied him. He wasn't sure if it was a peace offering or a test. Maybe both. Inside the office, Emily peeked through the window. "Is that Daniel?" she asked, already halfway to the door. Daniel crouched slightly to greet her, smile softening. "Hey, Emily. I was hoping to see you. You like fancy dresses?" Her eyes lit up. "Like the twirly kind?" "The twirliest," he promised. She spun on the spot just thinking about it. Can Daddy wear a suit? Michael gave her a look. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But as he looked back at Daniel, this man from a glass tower world who somehow kept showing up in theirs, Michael found himself nodding. All right, he said. We'll come. Daniel smiled, slow and genuine. Good. I'll have someone send the details. As he turned to leave, Emily whispered, I bet there'll be sparkly lights. Michael glanced down at her, then back toward Daniel's fading figure. Yeah, he said quietly. I bet there will. The city skyline glittered like it had been dipped in diamonds, each building lit up against the deep navy of night. Michael had driven the borrowed Koran immaculate black sedan. Daniel had sent himself and tried not to grip the wheel like it might bite. Emily sat beside him in the back seat, absolutely glowing in a pale blue dress with a sparkly ribbon around the waist. Her feet swung excitedly, silver shoes catching the light. As they pulled up to the towering glass building, Michael stared out at the red carpet rolled across the entrance. People in gowns and tuxedos floated past like they belonged there. Laughter and camera flashes weaving through the air. He swallowed hard. This is something, he muttered. Emily leaned forward, eyes wide. It's like Cinderella's castle, only taller. A valet opened the door before Michael could talk himself out of it. He stepped out awkwardly, tugging at the borrowed tie that felt more like a noose. Then he turned to help Emily, whose excitement far outweighed his nerves. She took his hand without hesitation, trusting him like she always did. Inside, the gala sparkled even more gold chandeliers like frozen fireworks, tables draped in white linen, a string quartet playing soft music that drifted like perfume through the air. Waiters moved between guests carrying champagne and tiny food on silver trays. Michael caught a few eyes turning their way, curious glances, some polite, others not. He could feel the question in the room like static. Who let the mechanic in? He stood taller. Then Daniel appeared. He was dressed in a crisp, charcoal tuxedo, all calm elegance and easy charm. But the moment he saw them, his face lit up in a way that had nothing to do with business. He crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside Emily, who beamed at him like he'd hung the stars himself. You look amazing, he told her sincerely. She twirled once, giggling. It's twirly. Daniel looked up at Michael. You clean up better than you think. Michael shrugged, uncomfortable but honest. Still feels like I'm wearing someone else's skin. Daniel's smile didn't waver. That's okay. Tonight, you're exactly where you're meant to be. And somehow, Michael wasn't so sure that was wrong. Michael had never seen so many polished shoes in one place. Patent leather, glossy like mirrors, pacing across marble floors under chandeliers so bright they felt like a second sun. Everything gleamed. Champagne flutes, golden cufflinks, smiles too sharp to be sincere. He stood near the edge of the ballroom, Emily at his side nibbling on a tiny dessert she'd described as a cupcake that forgot to grow up. She seemed perfectly content, twirling in her dress and humming along to the distant music. Michael, on the other hand, felt like he'd walked into someone else's dream. Or maybe their trap. He could feel the eyes. They weren't loud, those stares, but they were there, slipping over him like judgment in a tailored suit. Men with $1,000 watches and women with perfect posture whispered behind cocktail glasses. A few smiled tightly. Most didn't bother. He was the stranger in the room, the wrong thread in a silk tapestry. "Who is he?" someone murmured not far off. "Doesn't look like Mercer's usual company." "Mechanic, I heard. From some back-road town. He brought a child?" Michael pretended not to hear, but it scraped under his skin like sandpaper. He adjusted his collar too tight and took a steadying breath. He'd faced worse. He'd held his wife's hand through chemo, buried her, woke up at 3 a.m. to rock Emily through fevers and nightmares. Fought to keep the lights on when bills piled higher than hope. So no, a room full of bored millionaires wasn't going to break him. He felt a small tug at his sleeve. "You okay, Daddy?" Emily asked, looking up at him with wide, honest eyes. Michael knelt beside her, brushing a loose curl behind her ear. "I'm fine, baby. People are looking. I know, he said. Then smiled. But they don't matter. Across the room, Daniel noticed the attention and started making his way toward them. But Michael gently waved him off. Not out of anger. Just to let him know it was okay. Because Michael Turner didn't need a tuxedo or a title to know who he was. He was the guy who showed up, who fixed things, who kept going. Let them whisper. He wasn't here for them anyway. Later in the evening, when the music softened and the crowd began drifting toward the open bar and silent auction tables, Daniel found Michael on the rooftop terrace. The city sprawled beneath them in a grid of lights and motion, the air cooler up here, quieter. Michael stood near the railing, hands in his pockets, the skyline reflecting in his eyes like he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or exhausted by it. Daniel approached slowly, holding 2 glasses of bourbon, offering one without a word. Michael took it with a nod, eyes still on the horizon. "You ever get used to this?" he asked. Daniel took a sip before answering. "You get numb to it. That's not the same." Michael gave a low grunt of acknowledgement. "I figured." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging faintly at their jackets. Daniel leaned against the railing, then spoke quieter than before, like the city might overhear him if he wasn't careful. "My dad left when I was 8. Mom worked 2 jobs, most nights. We lived in a walk-up with radiators that clanged like ghosts and a lock that barely worked. But I had this notebook, just a cheap spiral-bound thing, and I used to draw all the time. Little houses, cities, things I wanted to build. Things I wanted to escape to." He paused, watching a plane blink across the sky. "Eventually, I did build them. The company, the towers, the money, all of it. And it worked. Everyone around me got quieter, nicer, easier to read, because I already knew what they wanted." Michael glanced over. "What about what you wanted?" Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the part I lost track of." He pulled something from his coat, pocket folded carefully, edges softened. "The drawing, Emily's." "I know it's just crayons on paper," Daniel said. "But when I found this in the car, I felt seen. Like someone had held a mirror up and said, 'You're still in there. The real you.' I hadn't felt that in a long time." Michael looked at the drawing, then at Daniel. He saw something raw behind the polished exterior. Not the CEO. Not the name. Just a man who'd been lonely for too long, holding on to a child's drawing like it was the last honest thing in his world. "Emily's got a good eye," Michael said quietly. Daniel nodded. "She saw something I forgot was even there." And for the first time all night, they weren't 2 men from different worlds. Just 2 fathers trying to hold on to the parts of themselves that still mattered. The hum of the rooftop lights flickered gently as the gala continued below, a murmur of music and laughter rising like steam from a distant world. Michael leaned back against the railing, the bourbon warming his chest, his thoughts still tangled in Daniel's confession. "I've been thinking," Daniel said carefully, like stepping across thin ice, "about your shop, the way you run things, the kind of work you do." Michael raised an eyebrow. "This your lead? Into buying me out?" Daniel shook his head, smiling. "No, this isn't about buying anything. It's about building something with you." Michael said nothing, but the silence held weight. "I want to offer you a position," Daniel continued. "Head of Vehicle Operations at Mercer Technologies. You'd oversee our in-house vehicle engineering, garage teams, training programs, even help design new tools. It's not corporate fluff. It's real work, hands-on. You'd have full autonomy. Build the team your way." Michael blinked, almost laughed, but didn't. He searched Daniel's face for a punchline, and when none came, he looked away. "Why me?" "Because I've got engineers with 10 degrees and no clue how to lead," Daniel said. "I've got managers who talk clean and polished data but wouldn't know the first thing about fixing a radiator with a coat hanger and 2 paper clips. You know people, you know the work. And, most of all, I trust you." Michael took a slow sip of bourbon, letting the words settle. It was a dream job. One he'd never dreamed. It came with a paycheck he couldn't imagine, resources he'd never touched, and a future that looked a lot more secure than busted mufflers and late rent, but it also meant leaving Maplewood. Leaving the comfort of the known. Uprooting Emily. Starting over in a world that didn't run on grease and grit, but on polish and perception. "I'm not a suit, Daniel," he said quietly. "I'm not you." Daniel nodded. "I'm not asking you to be me, I'm asking you to be you, but with more room to grow." The offer hung between them, heavy and bright. Michael didn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time, he allowed himself to picture something he hadn't in a long time. A life after survival. A life that might just be worth risking for. The following morning, the shop was quiet, too quiet. Michael stood by the bay door, sipping his second cup of coffee as the sunlight crept across the cracked concrete floor. The air smelled like motor oil and dust and the faint sweetness of Emily's shampoo from the room next door. He hadn't told her yet. The offer sat in his mind like a stone on his chest, unmoving and undeniable. Daniel had sent over the detailed salary, relocation package, full benefits, a private school for Emily, even a generous transition timeline. It was more than generous. It was everything Michael had never asked for, all laid out like someone had finally seen his worth and wasn't afraid to say so. And yet, he hadn't slept. His eyes drifted toward the wall beside the office door lined with Polaroids, old service receipts, hand-scrawled thank you notes from customers over the years. A picture of Emily at 4, holding a wrench almost as big as her arm. Another of Michael and Old Man Jenkins elbow deep in a busted transmission, both grinning like they'd won the lottery. This place wasn't just where he worked, it was where he healed. Where he raised his daughter. Where grief had finally made peace with routine. Emily padded into the garage in her socks, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're up early," she mumbled. Michael crouched to her level, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "So are you." She leaned into his side, still warm and soft from sleep. "Is Daniel coming today?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." She paused, looking up at him. "I like when he's around. He listens good." Michael swallowed hard. "Yeah, he does." He stood and walked her to the break room, setting out cereal and her favorite chipped bowl. As she ate, he stared out the window at the quiet street, his thoughts circling like vultures. Leaving Maplewood meant better opportunities, more security. A future Emily deserved. But it also meant saying goodbye to the only life she'd ever known. To neighbors who waved without reason. To the diner that kept her favorite crayons behind the counter. To the garage that held her childhood like a second home. It wasn't just about moving. It was about becoming something else. And Michael wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of who they were. To reach for who they might become. Word in Maplewood traveled the way gossip always did, faster than truth, louder than facts, and with more opinions than ears. By the end of the week, half the town knew that Michael Turner had been offered some bigwig job by that fancy guy in the suit. The details changed depending on who you asked. Some said Michael was going to Hollywood. Others swore he'd be managing a fleet of self-driving cars in Dubai. The reality and executive position at Mercer Technologies sounded made up, even when Michael said it out loud. The first person to corner him was Mrs. Jensen from the bakery, wiping flour from her hands as she leaned across the counter. "Michael Turner, don't you dare leave this town without telling me who's going to fix my van when it refuses to start in the snow," she said, half teasing, half terrified. "I haven't said yes yet," Michael replied, managing a tired smile. "You'd be a fool to say no," she added, softening. "You deserve good things, Han. You and that little girl both." Later, Ricketh, teenage apprentice who swept floors and asked a million questions, sat on the workbench with crossed arms and a sulk he didn't try to hide. "So, that's it? You're going to take off and leave me with Jenkins's truck and no clue what I'm doing?" Michael handed him a wrench. "You're better than you think, kid, but I'm not gone yet." Ricky rolled his eyes. "You'd be wasted behind a desk." "I'd be in a different kind of garage," Michael offered. Still, not everyone was thrilled. Pete, from the hardware store, cornered him outside the diner one morning, voice low with suspicion. "These people come into towns like ours, all smiles and big promises. Then they pluck the good ones and leave the rest of us behind." Michael didn't argue, because part of him understood. Leaving a small town always looked like betrayal from the ones who stayed. But then came the notes, folded slips of paper from customers. A card slid under the garage door after hours, signed with a shaky hand. "You're the heart of this town, but even hearts deserve to dream." By week's end, Michael stood in the center of his shop, surrounded by decades of elbow grease and community, and realized that Maplewood wouldn't hold him back, but it would miss him. And that mattered more than he ever expected. The sign still read Turner's Auto, though the paint had faded to a dull blue and one corner of the wooden board was cracked from last winter's freeze. Michael stood in front of it that morning, longer than usual, keys in hand, the bell above the door jingling behind him like it always did, cheerful and familiar, even when everything inside felt like a goodbye. The shop smelled the same: oil, rubber, a trace of old coffee, and warm metal. But it felt quieter now. Like the building itself knew what was coming. He had already told the regulars. One by one, they'd come in over the past few days, some bringing pie, others just words. "Proud of you, Mike. Don't forget us. Don't change too much." He'd nodded through it all, grateful and aching at the same time. Today, though, was the final stretch. He moved through the bays slowly, touching things without realizing he was doing it. This old toolbox, the cracked stool in Bay 2 where Emily used to sit while he worked, the wall with all the penciled height marks from her younger years, uneven but lovingly tracked. He packed methodically, like he always did. One drawer at a time, tools that had seen decades of repairs, notes scribbled on yellowing notepads, a screwdriver with a duct-taped handle he refused to throw away. The clatter of the shop had always been comforting, but now each drawer closing sounded like a chapter ending. Emily sat at the counter, a crayon in her hand and her feet swinging above the floor. She was quiet, drawing a picture of the garage, of him, bent under a hood, of her watching from the window, of a sign that read Daddy's Place. He looked over at her and smiled, but it faltered. "You okay, Em?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm just drawing it, so we remember, just in case we miss it later." His throat tightened. He walked over and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We'll always remember," he said. "Every bit of it." The sun slanted through the garage doors, casting long golden shadows. Michael turned off the lights one bay at a time, the switches clicking like soft punctuation marks. And when the final one went dark, he stood still for a moment, this heart full of grease and gratitude, and whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." The moving truck rumbled out of Maplewood just after sunrise, kicking up a small trail of dust as it rolled past the diner, the library, and the playground where Emily had learned to ride her bike. Michael followed behind in the SUV. Daniel had insisted he take company vehicle now, part of the new life. The one he still wasn't sure he believed was real. Emily sat in the back seat, hugging her favorite stuffed dinosaur and watching the town shrink in the rearview mirror. She didn't cry. She didn't ask to stay. But her silence was heavy, like she knew this goodbye was bigger than the ones before. Michael adjusted the rear view, catching her eyes. "You okay, kiddo?" She nodded slowly. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how this isn't the end. It's just a new page." He let out a soft breath, part laugh, part disbelief. "When did you get so wise?" She shrugged. "Books." They drove in silence for a while, the flat fields giving way to distant city skylines, buildings like giants rising out of the earth. Michael gripped the wheel tighter the closer they got. Everything was bigger here, louder, cleaner, sharper. By the time they reached the apartment corporate leased, fully furnished, overlooking a small park, Michael's stomach was in knots. A concierge greeted them by name. A man in a pressed shirt unloaded their bags. Emily's room had built-in shelves and a view of the water. It felt like someone else's life. Later, After the boxes were stacked inside and the door clicked shut behind the movers, Michael stood in the middle of the unfamiliar living room. Hardwood floors, stainless steel appliances. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Emily wandered to the balcony and pressed her face to the glass. "Daddy," she said, "the buildings look like stars." He walked over, crouched beside her, and rested his hand on her shoulder. "They do," he agreed. And for the first time since signing the offer, he let himself believe this could be okay. Not easy. Not perfect, but possible. With her by his side, anything was. The elevator dinged softly as it opened onto the 36th floor of Mercer Technologies headquarters, revealing a sleek hallway bathed in glass and polished chrome. Michael stepped out, adjusting the collar of his unfamiliar dress shirt for the third time, the fabric stiff against his neck. Everything here gleamed, the walls, the floors, even the people. He walked past assistants, clicking across marble tiles in heels, suits that probably cost more than his entire toolbox, and screens displaying numbers he couldn't make sense of. No one made eye contact. Everyone moved with purpose, like they'd been briefed by a general. A young woman met him at the end of the hallway. "Mr. Turner? I'm Paige. I'll be helping you get oriented today." Michael offered a small smile and a firm handshake. "Just Michael's fine." She nodded, polite but brisk. "Right this way." She led him through the maze offices with glass walls, departments labeled in sleek fonts. Innovations, sustainability, fleet engineering. When they reached his section, she gestured toward a wide workspace with a view of the skyline. A nameplate already sat on the desk. Michael Turner, Director of Vehicle Operations. It didn't feel real. The desk had multiple monitors, a tablet, and a phone with more buttons than sense. Michael stared at it all, then looked down at his hand calloused, nicked, more used to turning bolts than touching touchscreens. "Do I need a manual to work this thing?" he joked, tapping the desk phone. Paige gave a practiced smile. "You'll catch on." He doubted it. By noon, he'd been introduced to a dozen engineers, 2 executives, and 3 software platforms he couldn't pronounce. Everyone was courteous, professional, but distant. Polished in a way that made him feel like a walking oil stain. At one point, a young man in a crisp blazer asked, "So, you actually worked in a real garage?" Michael nodded. "Every day for 15 years. The man blinked. "Huh. That's kind of cool." Kind of. By the time Daniel dropped by at the end of the day, Michael was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at a screen, showing fleet analytics and engine performance metrics. Daniel smirked. "Still breathing?" Michael rubbed his eyes. "Barely. If anyone asks, I'm faking it till I make it." Daniel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Good. That's how half the people in this building started." Michael cracked a smile. Overwhelmed or not, he was here. And he wasn't giving up. The apartment was beautiful high ceilings, big windows, clean white walls that echoed when you talked too loud. But for Emily, it didn't feel like home. Not yet. Her bedroom had a view of the river, a desk with more drawers than she knew what to put in, and a bookshelf already filled with glossy new books Daniel had sent up the day they moved in. Still, most nights, she curled up under the same old dinosaur blanket she'd had since she was 3. Clutching her worn-out stuffed stegosaurus and listening to the distant hum of the city below. Everything was different here. At school, the kids wore polished shoes and uniforms that never had stains. They had iPads instead of notebooks, smartboards instead of chalk, and some of them had never even heard of Maplewood. When Emily said she used to help her dad in the garage, one girl blinked and asked, "Wait, like, you worked? With tools?" She'd smiled, shyly. "Sometimes. I was good at finding the right wrenches." The girl had wrinkled her nose. "My mom says grease is gross." Emily had said nothing after that. She missed her old school, where she could wear mismatched socks and still get a gold star for her drawings. Where the librarian saved the best books for her, and Mrs. Perkins always let her stay in from recess to read when she didn't feel like running. Here, everything was shiny. Everything felt watched. Back at the apartment, She tried to draw like she used to, but the pictures didn't come out right. She missed the smell of the shop, the warm clatter of tools, the way her dad would hum under his breath while fixing someone's car. And she missed the way people said her name in Maplewood. Like they knew her. One evening, as Michael came home from another long day of meetings, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by untouched art supplies. He knelt beside her. "Hey, Em, everything okay?" She shrugged. "I don't know how to be here yet." He pulled her into his arms. "That's all right, I don't either." She leaned into him, small and tired. "Can we still be us here?" Michael kissed the top of her head. "Always, kiddo. No matter the city, no matter the view, we're still us." The days began to blur. Boardrooms, data sheets, emails with subject lines that never stopped piling up. Michael found himself waking before the sun, suiting up, and slipping into a life that still didn't feel like his, like he was wearing someone else's skin every time he stepped into the glass building with its quiet elevators and polite nods. He did the job, managed the teams, oversaw new designs, even pitched an idea that made one of the lead engineers say, "That's actually brilliant." But the wins felt distant, numb, like checking off a box instead of fixing something broken with his hands. At night, he came home exhausted, loosening his tie before he even got through the door. Emily would be at the kitchen table, sometimes working on homework, sometimes just doodling. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't light up her whole face like it used to. There were shadows now, questions she didn't know how to ask. And then there were the small things that grew louder. The way his coworkers said, "You're settling in well for someone without formal training." The forced smiles at networking events, where people talked about legacy and scalability, but never once mentioned kindness. The way Emily flinched when he missed her school's open house because a meeting ran late. Michael stood in front of the mirror one night, his dress shirt half-buttoned, tie hanging around his neck like a noose. He stared at himself, at the man who once fixed engines by feel and raised a daughter on hope and duct tape. Who was he now? He missed grease under his fingernails, missed the clink of tools and the trust in a neighbor's eyes when he said, "I'll take care of it." Here, everything felt measured, transactional. His worth wasn't in what he could do, it was in who he impressed. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his hands together. They were clean. Too clean. This life, for all its polish, was starting to feel like a showroom carshany, expensive, and utterly lifeless under the hood. And for the first time since he said yes to the job, Michael wondered if the price of this new world might be himself. It started with a misplaced part number. A shipment of experimental electric drivetrains custom, built for a private fleet of international clients, was approved under Michael's oversight. Only, somewhere between engineering's final review and operations' green light, a software glitch went unnoticed. It wasn't catastrophic, not dangerous, but it meant delays, redesigns, and about $6 million in projected losses. The email hit at 7:42 a.m. Urgent. Distribution error, traced to vehicle ops requesting immediate review. Michael stared at the screen, heart hammering. He didn't need to read the thread twice to know what it meant. Somewhere, somehow, he'd missed a step. Maybe a checkbox. Maybe a sign-off that had slipped between one too many meetings and the 100 tiny decisions he'd never been trained to juggle. By 9:00, he was in a conference room, with Daniel and 3 other department heads who he barely knew, and one who always wore a smirk like he was waiting for someone to fail. "Look," Michael said, trying to keep his voice level, "I signed off on the specs that were cleared by engineering. I trusted the system." One of the suits leaned forward. "But you were the final authorization, which means the liability falls on me," Michael finished. "Yeah, I got that part." Daniel said nothing for a moment, just sat still, expression unreadable. Michael hated how much that rattled him. He didn't beg, didn't offer excuses, That wasn't his way. He owned it. It was his name on the paperwork, his responsibility. But what he didn't say, what he refused to say, was that he'd asked for clarification 2 days before, and no one had answered. Back in his office, he sat alone, jaw tight, fists clenched. The glow of the skyline beyond the window felt like a cruel joke now. This wasn't Maplewood. Here, mistakes didn't earn you second chances, they earned you board reviews. When he picked up Emily from school that afternoon, she noticed the silence right away. "Bad day?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Yeah, real bad." She reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his like she used to do when she was smaller. "Well," she said with quiet certainty, "you're still the best fixer I know." And for the first time all day, Michael let himself breathe. Not because the mistake didn't matter, but because he still did. At least to her. The boardroom was colder than usual, sterile and sharp, with glass walls that let you see everything but offered no protection. 12 people sat around the long black table, all with opinions polished and practiced. At the head sat Daniel Mercer, impeccably dressed as always, but today his jaw was set with something harder than charm. The quarterly review had started off as expected. Numbers, forecasts, the usual nodding and jargon. But then came the topic everyone had been circling since the drivetrain error: operational reliability and accountability under new leadership. Translation: Michael Turner. A woman from risk management cleared her throat delicately. It's not a personal indictment, of course, but given the scale of the oversight, we have to question whether promoting someone without corporate experience. Daniel held up a hand. She stopped, mid-sentence. The room went silent. "Let's be honest," Daniel said calmly. "This isn't about a single mistake. This is about whether you think a man without a business degree belongs at this table." No one responded. But their eyes said enough. Daniel stood. "Michael Turner has spent his life under hoods, in garages, fixing real problems, not talking about them in bullet points. The systems that failed him, they were built by us. He trusted our workflow, our hierarchy, and our silence. And still he took the blame like it was his alone." He looked around the table, his voice gaining quiet intensity. "Do you know how rare that is? To find someone who doesn't hide behind red tape or job titles? Someone who's not trying to climb, but just trying to do right?" A pause, sharp and clean. "He made one mistake. I've made dozens. The difference is, none of you were around to see mine." The room shifted, discomfort rippling across the suits and silks like a chill wind. "I won't fire him," Daniel said. "I won't demote him. In fact, I intend to back him, because this company doesn't just need more visionaries. It needs more men like Michael." Silence held for a beat too long. Then someone muttered, "If he messes up again." "He won't." Daniel cut in, steel behind his voice. "Because he'll have the right tools this time." When the meeting ended, Michael, waiting outside the door with folded arms and clenched teeth, saw Daniel emerge. Daniel didn't say much, just gave him a look. "Steady, certain. I've got your back," he said quietly. And for Michael, who had spent years standing alone, that meant more than any job title ever could. It was late past 9. The office, mostly dark except for the city lights, bleeding through the windows and the soft glow of a single desk lamp. Michael stood in Daniel's office, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. He hadn't knocked. Just walked in, quiet, but heavy, with something that had been building for weeks. Daniel looked up from his laptop, surprised but not startled. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" Michael closed the door behind him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, reading Michael's face like a map of roads he hadn't meant to take. "Go ahead." Michael took a breath, then stepped forward. "Why me? Why really? Why the job? The apartment? The school for Emily? All of it." "You earned it," Daniel said simply. Michael's jaw flexed. "No, I want the truth. Did I earn either? Did I remind you of something? Was I some project you picked up to feel better about your empire? Something real you could keep close like a trophy? Daniel sat with the silence for a moment. He didn't look offended, just tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying more than anyone noticed. "You think I went to Maplewood looking for you?" he asked. "I didn't even know you existed. I stopped at your shop because my car broke down. And I left with a drawing that hit me harder than any speech or profit margin ever has." Michael looked down, jaw tight, heart pounding. "I didn't offer you a job out of pity," Daniel continued. "I offered it because you were the most capable man I'd met in a decade. Because you fix things without ego. Because your daughter believes you're a hero and I started to, too." Michael met his eyes. "Then why keep me at a distance? Why let me sink in this world like I'm barely allowed to be part of it?" Daniel stood, his voice lower now. "Because I didn't want to break it. You and Emily. You're real. I didn't want to put a crack in something that good." Michael stared at him for a long time. "We're not fragile. You don't have to protect us from the truth." Daniel nodded. "Then here it is. You're not a project, Michael. You're the one thing in this company that reminds me what it means to believe in someone." Michael's shoulders eased just slightly. The tension hadn't vanished, but trust, slowly, was beginning to rebuild, not as something owed, but as something earned. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper and the occasional gentle squeak of a crayon. Emily sat cross-legged on the living room rug, tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated, the box of crayons beside her open and already missing its favorites. Michael sat nearby on the couch, sipping lukewarm coffee, a stack of reports forgotten in his lap. He watched her, curious. She'd been at it for nearly half an hour, completely focused, humming softly to herself. "What are you working on, Em?" he asked. She didn't look up. "You'll see." The skyline outside glowed in the late afternoon light. The glass towers painted gold. The city was loud, restless, always moving, but inside their apartment, it felt still for once. Settled, like the rhythm of their lives had slowed just enough to breathe. A few minutes later, Emily stood and approached him with both hands behind her back, grinning. "Close your eyes." Michael raised a brow but obeyed. "You know I hate surprises." "I know," she said cheerfully. "But you'll like this one." When she finally said, "Okay, open," he did, and what he saw made his breath catch. It was a drawing, full of bold color and unmistakable care. 3 figures stood side by side. One was tall with messy brown hair, holding a wrench in one hand. The second, smaller, with a bright dress and stars around her head. Emily, clearly. And the third, neat and sharp in a jacket with little lines for buttons, was unmistakably Daniel. Above them, in crayon-scrawled letters, it read, "My family. We fix things together." Michael stared at it, silent for a long beat. "You like it?" she asked, suddenly shy. He pulled her gently into his lap, kissing the top of her head. "I love it." She pointed to each figure. "That's you. That's me. And that's Daniel. I made his hair shinier this time." Michael chuckled. "Looks accurate." Emily leaned against him, voice soft. "It's better this way. When it's all of us. And just like that, without speeches or signatures, without business deals or city views." Emily drew what none of them had been able to say aloud. They were becoming something more than connected. They were becoming family. Sunday morning arrived, wrapped in quiet sunlight, the city softer than usual. No honking, no rush. Just a breeze through the balcony curtains and the smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen. Michael stood barefoot by the stove, flipping a slightly uneven pancake in a pan that had become their weekend tradition. Emily sat at the counter, legs swinging, crayon smudges on her cheeks and a plate already dusted with powdered sugar. Daniel leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand, looking more like a man at home than a CEO with 10,000 emails waiting. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't grand. But it felt right. After breakfast, they wandered into the park across the street, Emily racing ahead with her sketch pad tucked under one arm, calling out the names of flowers she made up on the spot. Michael and Daniel followed behind, quiet for a while. "You ever think about going back?" Daniel asked. Michael glanced at him. "To Maplewood?" Daniel nodded. Michael took a breath, watching Emily spin in circles beneath a tree, laughing. "Sometimes," he said, "it'll always be home in a way. The people, the rhythm, the way the shop used to hum when the sun came through the windows just right." He paused. "But I think I needed to learn that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person, or a moment, or a second chance." Daniel smiled. "You've changed." Michael gave a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I noticed." They reached the bench near the pond, Emily's new favorite drawing spot. She was already seated, crayons spilled around her, sketching the three of them again. This time there was a picnic blanket, a big tree, a little dog she claimed they'd get, eventually. Michael sat down beside her, ruffling her hair. "What are you calling this one?" she grinned. "The future." Daniel sat on her other side, glancing down. "Do I still have shiny hair in this one?" "Shiniest," she confirmed proudly. And in that moment, with the laughter, the paper smudges, and the warmth of something he hadn't dared to hope for, Michael realized the truth. Home wasn't behind them. It was right here, being built one crayon line, one quiet morning, one hard-earned choice at a time. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was just holding everything together. He felt like he was living,